Okay, good afternoon, folks. This is Ray Grafton. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer with AI Certified. It's our great pleasure to kick off first of a series of monthly webinars. And today's topic, as you can see on screen here, is going to be on the EU AI Act. And Alan Thornton is our guest subject matter expert. So without further ado, we're going to hand it over to Alan. If there is any questions, please do put them in the chat. And if we have time towards the end, we can all pop on screen and we can do a bit of a Q&A. There will be some follow-up material for anybody who needs it, so we'll make you all aware of that later. Over to you, Alan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray. Delighted to be here at this first webinar. And welcome to everybody who has joined. Hopefully, you can take away some practical next steps for your own compliance framework setup within your businesses or projects going forward. So just before we kick off, I would like to bring your attention to a little asterisk on this first page that says some graphic content supported by AI. This is what's called the transparency label, and we will see a bit more about this throughout today's webinar and how that may apply to your own business or project and the use cases you have within those going forward. So first of all, as I get started, I'd like to inform everybody of what AI Certified actually is, who they are, what they do. AI Certified provide certification from foundational knowledge to expert level capability. The certifications are designed to help you build practical AI skills, earn recognized credentials, and keep you moving forward in your career. So very, very cool group of people there, and I would definitely hang on till the end. They have a nice offer for everybody who has attended. A tiny piece about myself. So I am Alan Thornton. I am the founder of AI Compliance.app and TipCan Solutions. I've been involved in business, tech, and marketing for over 16 years. I've worked with all sizes of businesses, from startups to multinationals, all across the globe, United States, Europe, Asia. I regularly give sessions like this, and I run the EU AI Act Navigator and regulated newsletters on LinkedIn. And our AI compliance.app tool is currently supporting just over 3,000 teams at the moment, which is fantastic. Today, we are going to cover the recent regulatory shift. It was just a major change in May, the compliance roadmap, critical updates in 2026, the risk levels so everybody understands where their AI use cases fall within that hierarchy and what they may need to do on their checklist, the business compliance checklist, which is what everybody is here for. We will cover a piece on governance, data rigor, and transparency. We will also look at compliance budgeting very, very briefly, a summary of what was covered today, and if we have time, as Ray mentions, we will take a look at some questions as well. So jumping straight in, the regulatory shift, so from theory to enforcement, as of May 2026, specifically May 7th, so not too long ago, the EU AI Act moved beyond legislative debates into a critical enforcement phase. So organizations are now transitioning from general AI literacy to formal audited governance frameworks. So understanding the distinction between the different risk tiers is no longer optional for any business or project out there using AI or providing AI, whether you are a deployer or a user. You will have some sort of compliance and conformity governance requirements. And in certain high risk cases, we will look at what's called a conformity assessment, and you must complete that depending on your product and your use case to actually gain access to the market. So critical piece of information for certain people. The compliance roadmap, so from 2025 through to 2027, in February 2025, mandatory AI literacy for all staff came into force. A lot of people miss this, are not aware of this. Currently, there are no enforcement penalties for not being on top of this, but any company or charity that has employees or volunteers that use AI tools or develop AI tools within that project or company must supply training, AI training on bias and different things like that for those employees. So it doesn't matter what AI they're using, if they're using it on the company or the charity to provide training, to those individuals, and that is essentially been mandatory since February 2025. But you won't really see any enforcement on that until August this year. But it's definitely something to be on top of. Get your team members trained up. It just it will help you in the long run. August 2025, then we move through the year. The GPIA model obligations and codes of practice became applicable. So last July 2025, the first challenge from outside forces against the EU AI Act came into effect from the United States and China, who basically said that the act was too hard to follow. They couldn't get the processes and frameworks in place in time, and they wanted to delay different elements of the act and relevant deadlines that were coming up. So at that time, the European Union did not cave, and they basically said, no, we're going to run with the current roadmap of deadlines as they exist. So the transparency and GPIA obligations kicked in August 2025, with the enforcement deadline for that being August 2026 this year. August 2nd to be specific, and that is the transparency related rules, Article 50, and then prohibited use cases become fully banned and fully active. We'll talk about them in a minute as well. Just a little side note, GPA AI models like Claude, Grok, Gemini, whatever it may be, nearly all of the major providers signed up to the EU's Code of Conduct practice document last July. So if you use these tools, there's a handshake between you and these large providers and those use cases where you don't really need to fully document what's going on. You just have to have a basic use case log and a transparency label for any outputs that may be relevant. So that's good to know. And Meta was the only major provider that didn't sign on to that act. So if you use Meta AI tools for forward-facing deliverables or outputs, you may have an additional step within your compliance framework for AI use cases. That brings us then through to December 2027. This is a brand new date. High risk use case enforcement deadline was August 2027. So again, there was pressure put on the European Union in November to push back the high risk deadlines because they were basically too difficult to get on top of. It can take between 6 to 18 months, depending on the use case, to get a conformity assessment, technical documentation all in place for certain high risk use cases. So the European Union actually caved in November and said, right, we'll review this, we'll take a look at it. And on the 28th of April, just passed, they had what was called a trilogue, where they came together to take a look at, what can we do here? How can we delay it? How can we better look at the regulations that we really want to put in place? And that meeting failed. They didn't deliver on what they hoped to achieve. And they met again on May 7th, where they did come to an agreement, and they are now formalizing and finalizing that agreement, which will become set in cement around the EU AI Act. And that means the new high risk deadline is December 2027 instead of August 2nd, 2027. But the transparency related deadlines of August 2nd, 2026 did not move at all. So critical updates, deadline deferral, as I just mentioned. So the Annex 3 high risk requirements postponed from August to December to allow for those technical standards to be finalized. Industrial AI, there were new carve-outs for industrial AI embedded in machinery. So now these fall under EU machinery rules rather than the Act's high-risk regime. Now, a lot of these use cases fell into the minimal risk category because they may just be maintenance systems and things like that within factories. So there wasn't really a high compliance burden, but they've moved those industrial AI use cases out of the Act and into the EU machinery rules piece. And then GP AI maturity. So the AI office itself has finalized the kind of first evaluations on GP AI models, and compliance audits will begin in Q3 2026. So as I said, the enforcement deadline around transparency obligations, which is essentially GPAI, will kick in on August 2nd, 2026, and they will begin to audit pretty much instantly across the European Union. So that should be fun. And as we can see that note on the bottom, the EU undertook a trilogue finalize what will happen with deadlines and classification. And on April 28th, that failed. And on May 7th, they came to an agreement, which has been fantastic. So this is a bit of a brutal slide, but I think it gets the information across that I hope to convey. We're going to talk about the risk levels of different AI tools and use cases. We can see there are four categorizations: unacceptable risk, which is prohibited under the Acts right now; high risk use cases under Annex 3, things like HR and recruitment, finance and insurance, education, the medical space, anything really that touches human data, potentially creates outputs that will manipulate what's happening in the public. So anything around access to employment, public services, safety components within vehicles, law enforcement, for example, will be a high risk use case. Limited risk use cases with the transparency obligation from August 2nd. It's really around chatbots, emotion recognition, biometric categorization, deep fakes, generative AI, and impersonation. So anything that could be manipulative or be generated to have a commercial outcome essentially will be covered by the transparency obligations. And I will run through examples of what you may need to do and what you need to kind of check off to make sure you conform. The bottom of the rung and the pyramid here is the minimal risk. So spam filters, AI in video games, predictive text, autocorrect, things like this that don't really have any manipulative aspect or deepfake aspect or decision-making aspect over anything that's happening for the human beings that interact with them. So they do recommend, I think it's Article 94 Reticle 4. I'll have to be corrected on that if that's incorrect, but they recommend that you voluntarily disclose and log the AI use cases within this category. It's a smart thing to do. I think people should do it for sure. So high risk use cases with that enforcement deadline, have your frameworks and audit trails in place by December 2027. Limited risk transparency obligations under Article 50 for pretty much things that everybody is using. I don't think there are many businesses that don't have chatbots or use Gen AI to create campaigns for LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever it may be. I'm pretty sure nearly all businesses are using some sort of tool like this. So it's really, really critical to understand the use cases you have within your business, charity, or project and to categorize them correctly so you know what steps to undertake when building out your compliance framework. So we will jump into the compliance checklist and run through some of the key aspects that you need to stay on top of and what you can do to start that process now. The first is governance and literacy. So these four bullets are really, really important. This is what everybody has to do. Doesn't really matter what you do, what industry you're in. The act itself is industry and use case agnostic, really. It does categorize different use cases for severity of, what you need to be on top of from the compliance perspective, a human oversight perspective, bias control perspective, technical documentation perspective. But these four key points are what you would need to tick off kind of today or as soon as possible within your business. The very first thing is an inventory audit. So map every AI system used in your business. Doesn't matter if it's a proprietary tool that you're building or if it's supplied by a third party or you are essentially building a tool that, is like a wrapper of ChatGPT, but then you add additional functions to it and deliver that to the public as a service or a product. You need to know what people in your supply chain are doing. If you are a business that works with a marketing agency, for example, and they provide you with deliverables that you publish, from a promotional perspective, you need to have agreements in place with them as to who's responsible for transparency labeling. You need to understand what tools they use in that process. Do they track it? Can they tell you, yeah, look, for the video campaign that we delivered to you, we used VO3, for example, and for the graphic campaign, we used Gemini to produce everything there. And we have that tracked, labeled, audited. If you request that log from us, we can provide it to you. And that just covers you as the person who's putting out that content, and it covers them as users of AI who have delivered and deployed an end product use case to the public, basically through the company that employs them. So it's up to you as the company to have your internal use cases logged, whether it's a third-party vendor or proprietary tools you are building, and know in your partner chain and supply chain if anybody is supplying you with products. Maybe you use HubSpot, for example. Maybe you use some HR tool or company that you've trusted for a long time. You need to understand how the AI works within those products because, especially for HR tools, you could end up using it in a way that HubSpot, for example, is covered, but the way you deploy the AI without realizing it could be a high risk system instead of limited risk, which means your compliance requirements are going to be more of a burden internally to manage. So you definitely need to inventory audit all use cases, small team, big team. Get your people together, create a no judgment zone where people can be honest. One of the biggest problems I see in this space, managers get their teams together, they ask, where are we using AI? What are we using it for? They get about 90% of the feedback because, John or Mary has decided that they're going to just use Copilot in the background to edit some final text for outreach campaigns and marketing, and I don't think it's a big deal. So you really need to create a space where people can be honest about the tools that they use within the company, so you can, create those audit logs, and get set up from a compliance perspective on that. But also from a strategy perspective, you might find 3 people are using Copilot, 7 people are using ChatGPT. Do we really need to be running these two systems? We're exposed on two fronts here, especially if we're not tracking these use cases properly. Let's get somebody in maybe to say, if you want to do this, this, and this, you're best going with Gemini. If you want to do this, this, and this, you're best going with Claude, for example. So creating the inventory audit not only gets your compliance framework set up going, it also gives you that strategic kind of thought process to understand what's the best step moving forward from AI use case perspective. You can remove the bloat basically and become more efficient. AI literacy program, super, super important, and something obviously AI certified would be able to support businesses with as well. Verify all staff have completed mandatory training. So it is a legacy requirement within the Act, already active. And, people aren't going to come beating down your door if you don't have the training in place. But if anybody asks the question after August 2nd, you could be in a bit of trouble. Assign responsibility. It is critical that somebody is appointed, a qualified or responsible person within the company to oversee AI compliance and risk monitoring. So they will maintain the governance and compliance framework in-house for you. Or if you work with a large firm or a solicitor that you trust, they can do that for you as well. But you just need to have somebody named and make sure that they're looking after everything. There is a requirement within the Act itself, depending on the use case, especially for high risk use cases like HR and finance, that there would be a human oversight piece produced every 3 months. So you need to stay on top of what's going on and be able to produce reports and updates to say it's business as usual, nothing has changed, or there has been these changes over the 3 months, and these are the documentation updates we have created, and they're all logged, and we're good to go in the background. So you need to have somebody responsible for overseeing that, make sure that they're named and assigned. And also you want to run a fundamental rights impact assessment depending on your use case. So like I said, if you have a credit scoring tool or a HR tool that's screening CVs, you want to run that FRIA, fundamental rights impact assessment, on this tool to understand where the risks are. Are there any potential gaps? Is the provider of this tool on top of this? Can they provide you with documentation you can log to say this is how we handle that? And this is what we expect the risks to be, the known risks. Run that fundamental rights impact assessment. It's very, very important on anything that touches real human data and potentially makes decisions on that data. The technical and data rigor piece, really, really important. Obviously, a lot of people are familiar with GDPR, especially in the European Union. But the EU AI Act also covers this, and it's a prediction of mine. It's not active right now, but I believe the EU AI Act will probably absorb GDPR because there is not much data that exists anymore that isn't touched by artificial intelligence in some way. So there are parts of the EU AI Act and the GDPR Act in Europe that interlink at the moment, but I think as time goes on and AI becomes more prevalent across business use cases, maybe in the next 2 or 3 years, I think the GDPR Act will become a subset of the EU AI Act. So for high risk systems, data sets must be relevant, representative, and to the best extent possible, free of errors. So obviously you want to be scrubbing the databases that you use. You want to be double checking them regularly, have that plan in place and documented as to how you manage that, be able to produce those quarterly updates on that happening to make sure you meet the requirements of the Act. Bias detection and mitigation testing are super important. You want to understand how the AI tool makes the decisions. If you notice that something's a bit off or it started to kind of change, how it produces its outputs, are you scanning how it's operating in the background for bias, and if it's starting to kind of lean one way or the other, how do you manage that? What's your SOP or standard procedure for that? Data lineage tracking and documentation, super important. What data sets are you using? Who has access to them? Who oversees them? How are they reviewed and monitored? Robustness against adversarial attacks. So from a cybersecurity perspective, the Act covers this a little bit. You know, what policy do you have in place? What documentation, procedure? How does the human chain work around understanding if there is an attack on your system? How do you manage it? Can you shut down one part of your system without affecting the rest of your business operations is another great example as to, you know, the importance of having policies around these kind of things. So depending on your use case, and apologies, I'm flying through this a little bit because I am aware it is dense, but there's a lot to get through. Depending on the use case that you have, HR, finance, education, medical, conformity assessments can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months to fully flesh out. And this is what's involved. So essentially, the bridge between how rigorously you set up and manage the data and technical side and the conformity assessment is looking after your data and technical documentation is about basically doing the work in the background and building what you have. The conformity assessment is then about proving that to regulators. And as I said, the conformity assessment for certain high risk use cases is required to deliver this tool to the market. So if you build a HR system that you want to sell to European businesses, you have to have a conformity assessment completed, registered with the European Union, CE marked, before you can access the market. So it's very, very important that conformity assessments for high risk use cases are completed. The logic, you can use a self-assessment route. This is what most businesses will do, run the assessment yourself. The one thing to be aware of is you are legally liable for the accuracy of that assessment. You can obviously work with people you trust, firms, consultants, whatever it may be, to run a self-assessment on your tools and your products. And you know, you can get that support to be able to legally stand over the accuracy of the conformity assessment. So that is if you do it yourself. The other option, if you are building a tool with its own data sets, its own training models, you can go to what's called a national sandbox. So all member states in the European Union will have a national sandbox. The deadline for them to be set up, I believe, is August 2nd, 2026. We'll see if that deadline gets met. But essentially, you can register your product with a national sandbox in the jurisdiction that you are building in, and they will create a performance environment where you can deploy and test your model in a safe space where you can interact with elements of the public in a controlled fashion through the national sandbox without being in breach of the EU AI Act. So you can essentially test your high risk product through a national sandbox without having to wait to complete the conformity assessments before you get access to elements of the market. You don't have access to the full market, but at least you can deploy your product and work with the national sandbox to be building out that conformity assessment alongside testing. So really, really cool that that's there, but a bit of a headache for some people. A CE mark will then be required. So many business leaders don't realize AI will now be regulated similarly, apologies, to medical devices, like in a similar way to how medical devices and toys have a CE mark. It will be a visual proof of the shift in the regulation space that we are now no longer going from. There's AI everywhere. You don't know what it is. You don't know who manages it, what the quality is, what the standards are. Now a CE mark will be required. And you can see at the bottom directly from the Act text itself, the CE marking shall be subject to the general principles set out in Article 30 of the regulation number 765, 2008. So essentially, once you have passed the conformity assessment, registered with the European Union as a high risk system, you can apply a CE mark, and that's the kind of stamp of approval that you're good to go and trusted within the market. High risk process, we'll touch on this briefly. I know there's a lot going on here. So the first thing is to distinguish between, internal control, which is the fancy term for a self-assessment, or a third-party assessment, which is a notified body or an actual sandbox. You need to verify that the quality management system and technical documentation that you have set up around your AI use case meet the Act's requirements. You can see some examples of what's required here in the graphic. Model development, valid framework set up around governance, comprehensive bias and fairness assessments, AI incident response plan. So something really interesting, if there's a serious incident through AI, use case within your business. Let's say somebody's personal data is leaked, or information from their CV has gone out into the public through the AI system that you're using in a leak somehow, and that's basically breached their rights. So you've got 72 hours to report that incident to the AI office. And if you don't do that, you're subject to severe fines. Your entire company could actually be shut down, but it is a mandatory requirement that when an incident happens, you have 72 hours to report it to the AI office. So as you can see there, one of the blocks, AI incident response plan, bottom left, is a policy and framework you would need to have in place to understand how you deal with that if that eventuality was to happen within your company. You can see another one there is data governance frameworks, GDPR and the AI Act are aligned. Article 10 ties into Article 22, and then the Charter Article 8. So you can see how a lot of different things kind of mesh together here when AI is involved. It's going to take a lot of current standards and policies that already exist and absorb elements of them into the AI Act as well. The third step in the high risk process is the presumption of conformity. So mentioning that using harmonized standards like ISO or the IEC 42001 does simplify the process. So if you were to use one of those standards to put together your documentation and your policy framework kind of data piece in the background, that can speed up the process of passing the conformity assessments. The signing of the EU Declaration of Conformity and affixing the CE marking. So that will come once you pass the conformity assessments, everything is good, you have your technical documentation in place, you are compliant to the EU AI Act's standards relevant to the risk level categorization of your AI use case or product. And then the final thing would be registration. So once you pass all of those things, you will enter into the mandatory EU database for high-risk AI systems. So as I said, very important for anybody who's building an education-based tool, who's in the medical field, HR and recruitment, finance, and in some cases the public sector, and charities as well, depending on what AIs they're using, could also need to have their conformity assessments registered with the EU database for high-risk AI. So a bit there, but again, this essentially is a 5-step checklist to get your high-risk system sorted out. Transparency and evidence. So we step away from that high-risk category on the pyramid into the limited risk categorization, which is Article 50 through 52. And you can kind of see what's going on here. So it's about the labeling, tracking, monitoring of synthetic media, which is essentially anything created by AI. So providers must ensure outputs are marked in a machine-readable format and detectable as artificially generated. The example you see here on the side was a collaboration between Vogue and Guess to produce a new line of clothes and bags, as you can see here. That little piece of white writing on the left-hand side says produced by Seraphine Valora on AI. So this was a digital campaign and a physical campaign that took place last year. And they were one of the first people to actually put transparency labels, like you saw at the very start of this webinar, around the use of AI. So the model in that image is completely AI generated. There's absolutely nothing real about that person. They are completely fake. They were just created to place the clothes on, hold the bags, wear the hats, and so on. So you can see a great example in the physical world and the digital space of how a transparency label will function. So on the deepfake disclosure side, deployers must explicitly inform users if content is manipulated or generated, unless it is part of an artistic, creative, or satirical work with limitations. So I hear all the marketing agencies and advertisers out there going, brilliant, do we have an exemption? Unfortunately, you do not. So the exemption itself is for artists, musicians, writers, and satire, but only when the audience understands the work is completely fictional or expressive. So that essentially protects freedom of expression in from a non-commercial perspective. So if you're developing a movie that's purely for entertainment and it's completely built by AI, you aren't required to put a transparency label on there. But where full Article 50 regulations do apply is essentially anything that is commercially motivated or forward-facing to the public from a perspective of getting them to make a decision about something. So that would be advertising or marketing, commercial persuasion, as I mentioned, political messaging is a really big one, influencing consumer behavior, and realistic depictions of real people or events. So someone taking a screen grab of me and running around talking about the EU AI Act completely from the wrong end of the spectrum and promoting that it's me, it's all me. That deep fake would have somebody potentially fined up to 7.5 million euros if somebody was to do something like that. So that is the deterrent. It's definitely a better thing to get on the wave of transparency labels, especially for a brand and a charity, because if you label the things that have AI involved in them, and then don't label the things that don't, you build that trust piece where people get a clear understanding of where AI was used as a supportive tool to produce something, and where AI wasn't used, where you can really see the full human impact. So I think that will be really important for brands going forward. And there are some companies who are doing it really well, like Yes and Vogue at the moment, to build that consumer trust early on, really before this becomes a massive issue after August. So all of those contexts we can see there under where full Article 50 regulations apply. They will need to include transparency labels on any outputs that is related to a GPA use case. So if you use Gemini to create some advertising material, you need to put a label on it to say that AI was involved. So how are you going to manage this question for your team and yourself? How are you labeling content, managing those labels and use cases and the logs? Are they at the required standards under the EU AI Act? Is this something you need to look into? If you've got a chatbot, how are you going to manage that? If you have deep fake or synthetic media, what's that label look like? How are you tracking it? Machine readable HTTP headers if you're doing a lot of stuff online with AI generation involved. How are you going to put these labels together for the specific use cases, track them, log them, and have them monitored by the qualified or no mentioned person within your organization? So really key question if you're using GPAIs for any sort of output that's public facing, that's not just, like I said, an advertising campaign that's going out to the public. It could actually be a deck in a webinar that's going to stakeholders, for example. So that could be class as a public event like this. And I have my label at the very start, and then I have that logged in the background if anyone wants to ever ask. Very brief cost analysis, compliance budgeting. So on the SME side, roughly it costs between 5 and 15K to get yourself set up. Mid-market, high risk can be 15 to 50K. And for large enterprises, it can be anything north of 100,000 euros. So these estimates include technical implementation, legal gap analysis, and policy updates per system. So if you have multiple high-risk use cases, it could obviously get quite expensive quite quickly. A really good example I have is of self-driving car artificial intelligence tool. The founder had to pay 390,000 euros to get the relevant high risk technical conformity assessment completed from start to finish. They don't actually need it until December next year, but they've done it early. But the cost was pretty severe to the business, and it's something to be aware of when you reach out to solicitors, legal firms, anybody who can support you on this. I've seen quotes of 2 to 3 grand per document, even on the transparency side. So it's just something to be aware of. Keep your eyes out and plan for this into the future, and think about it from a strategic perspective. If you have until August 2nd to get it going, you're kind of out of time. You might need to drop the money quickly, but on the high risk side, you can build it into your strategy for the start of 2027, and really burn through that year to get yourself set up. So it's just something to be aware of. There is a cost associated to being compliant, similar to GDPR. If you work with a DPO, you'll be familiar with this kind of cost base. But not to scare people, it's just to give people a realistic expectation and understanding as to what they can expect out in the real world. So a general summary, I've actually flying through this, fantastic. 22 system inventory. So catalog every AI tool used, in-house versus vendor supplied. Critical. Very first step, do that. Talk to your team. Keep a non-judgment environment. Keep it open and friendly. Let people feel like they can tell you everything that they're doing with AI, even if it's something you aren't happy about. Just note it down. You can obviously deal with managing that later. Classification, identify your Article 50 transparency obligations around the GP AI use cases versus any Annex 3 high risk use cases you may have. So you're probably using Claude and ChatGPT for different things, or your marketing departments are, you may then be using a different tool in the HR department that could potentially fall into high risk. So what tools do you have? What categorizations do they fall into? Watermarking will become important from a transparency perspective on the machine readable side and potentially on the consumer facing sides, depending on how AI generated the content was. If you produce an image in Gemini now, for example, you will get a tiny little star in the bottom corner. Obviously, you can remove that, but Gemini watermarks AI generated images in that way. Meta now, for anything that appears through Meta AI on any of their systems, WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it may be, comes with a big AI info piece now. AI info will appear on your post and you'll be able to click it and it will describe kind of what AI generated content is and that this piece of content had AI involved in it. So Meta kind of do it for you. You can't avoid it. If you use a Meta AI, it will watermark it for you. It's just about tracking that then if that's your use case. Notice protocols to update any UI or UX to include mandatory interaction disclosures. If you visit the EU AI Navigator newsletter that I publish myself, the very top line is supported by AI, overseen by humans. That is the transparency indicator and disclosure. And my website, for example, says AI powered at the top. You can't miss it. So all the labels are always there to make sure that people understand where AI is involved. And then record keeping. So document transparency measures, provide evidence for audits. How you choose to do this is up to you. There would be recommended standards. There'd be a lot of people telling me, well, can I just use Google Sheets, log everything in? Of course you can do that, but there's no security on that information. For example, there's nothing really stopping an individual from going in and altering the use cases if a company was challenged and needed to produce information because they were accused of creating manipulative advertising campaigns, let's say from a competitor, and somebody in the background wanted to run in and change the logs to say, oh no, we didn't actually use ChatGPT to make this stuff. We've never used it before. They can obviously tamper with things like that in non-secure audit trail setups like Google Sheets or Google Docs, for example. There's no real way of locking that down. So I'd recommend looking into something that's tamper evidence. It doesn't have to be tamper proof, but just tamper evidence, something that will let you know that if anybody was to alter or edit the information on the audit logs, it would capture that information as well. So keep the log intact, but also let people know that an edit attempt was made or was successfully made. Either way, it's good to have that tamper evidence piece involved in your record keeping and audit trails where possible. Excellent. So, roughly 15 minutes left. So, hopefully that checklist was good for everybody, whether you are at the transparency level or the high risk level. I am happy to take some questions if they're in the chat or if Ray wants to let them pop in and ask the question directly.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do that.
So
And I
I'll
believe the
ask,
deck may be shared.
yeah, I'll ask my colleague Amy. Amy's our student officer for AI certified. If you could let everybody in. But we do have one question in the Q&A section from Lisa Tucker. So I believe Lisa's already on the AI program at the moment with our diploma course. And she's asking, how is this going to be overseen? Is there an impetus on each EU country to establish an oversight board similar to the DPO when the GDPR came out, or is it going to stay at the EU level? Um, do you foresee a lot of delays in the implementation of oversight of this, etc.?
Excellent question. So every country and member state in the bloc is required to have notified the European Union's office of the regulatory body within their jurisdiction. So the Department of Enterprise manages the AI office in Ireland, and then there are eight notified bodies that manage enforcement that feed into that. So, for example, the Central Bank of Ireland is nominated to look after finance and insurance. Comreg is there to look after marketing, advertising, and enforcement around those kind of things. So, yes, every member state has its own office that is responsible for enforcement and overseeing what's happening. As I said, the national sandboxes exist then in every jurisdiction as well that feed into this office. And if you are creating or using an Annex 3 level high risk system, you essentially cannot use that tool legally without the conformity assessments being in place, which means you have to go through the local office in your jurisdiction to ensure that you're legally using that AI use case. And the biggest risk initially this year will be around a complaint potentially from a competitor. I would be aware that that is an angle that people should be aware of and potentially afraid of, especially if you're in marketing and advertising. If you don't have the transparency side of things set up, let alone high risk, one marketing house could make a complaint against another, and if you can't produce the audit trails when Comreg comes looking, you're going to be open to severe penalties and obviously reputational damage. But to answer the question about enforcement and delays, they had already started in
Mm.
August to October 2025, so a long time ago. The Netherlands, Germany, France, their national bodies that were in place had started to do kind of faux or fake calls to businesses to be like, okay, so if this was a real EU AI Act audit, can you produce your documentation? Can you give us the audit logs? What's up? So they're very, very serious about enforcement on this. And as I said, for the transparency piece in August 2025, they didn't budge in the European Union for the deadline of August 2026. So I would take this seriously if I was a business owner, and I definitely would not advise it doesn't really affect me for now, or no one's ever going to know kind of thought process. If someone in your vendor supply chain comes asking, it's similar to the sustainability piece in Europe already, where Tesco asked the farmer, do they have their sustainability plan in place for their cheese? They just won't buy that cheese off them anymore. So that's going to be true now for AI use cases, especially on the transparency side from August 2nd.
Okay, 2026.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Lisa, I hope that answers your question. Uh, do let us know if there's any follow-up questions on that. Um, yeah, I think we have another question here. What do we think are the top tips for self-assessment for businesses?
Yes. So
This is from
running a
Giuseppe.
conformity, yeah, running a conformity assessment can be quite intense, especially when you have 12 headings to complete. So to run a self-assessment, you would need some sort of support. Like I said, if you're building a proprietary tool, like a brand new product, and you're worried about the cost implementation of a conformity assessment, go to the national sandbox. That would be the very first point I would make around a brand new AI tool or system. If you are using something that is coming from a third party vendor and you're tweaking it, and you want to run an internal conformity assessment, you'll need to speak to somebody to get the 12 headings. So as I mentioned, you're going to need a human oversight policy procedure. You're going to need technical documentation around the models that are in use, the third party models, how they're using them, how they run bias control, how you manage GDPR breaches and things like this. So I would recommend you speak to a professional or find a software that can provide an overview template. The very last thing you can do quickly from a self-assessment perspective is ask your GPAI under the EU AI Act's Annex 3 high risk categorization for X type of tool, whatever you have. What are the 12 headings I need to start building documentation out for? And that will at least give you a starting point, but you will probably need some sort of external support.
Hmm. Okay, thank you for that, Alan. If there are any other questions, guys, please put them into the Q&A feature. So unfortunately, we don't have functionality to let you in ask live, but you can ask via the Q&A. So
Perfect. All right.
Lisa's just responded. She said, "Yes, thanks. I have one other thought. If there's time for globally kind of a global business that either have subsidiary offices in the EU or contract people in the EU, are they required to adhere to the Act?" It's a good question.
The answer is yes. So if you are outside of the European Union and providing a service or product with AI involved, the EU AI Act full regulation applies to you. So, a good example, I work with a company in Colombia who produce chatbots for the European markets, specifically Germany and Ireland. And their CEO was on top of this last November, and I've been working with him since then to build out the transparency obligations for them so that they can continue to trade in the European Union. If they hadn't have done that or had it in place for this August, they would have to cease providing the service to the European Union. So if you are a company in America and you have an office in Europe that's responsible for certain services or products that are delivered within Europe, yes, they will have to conform to the EU AI Act. And then I would imagine the office in the United States, if it was the headquarters, for example, would just mirror that and have a record of it on their side as well. So in the European office, they would probably nominate their qualified person there, build out their audit trails and their compliance framework, and then the US office would have an access to that or a mirrored version of it. And what's interesting now is the US just launched their own AI Act, essentially, regulations in March and April. China did the same in February. So people are going to have to start thinking about how they can form in various different markets if you trade within the EU and beyond.
Mm, got it. Got it. Okay. So let me just check. Do we have any more questions in the chat? I think that's everything. I think my key takeaways from what you've told us today, Alan, um, you know, I suppose if I was to put myself in, and we are in this position for our business in the high risk category, basic steps. So, like, where do we start, right? And I think the distinction of know your role. Are you a provider and building and putting AI systems on the market, or are you a deployer? You're using someone else's AI in your business operations. So that's all of us using ChatGPT or any LLM. So I think it's good to know that distinction. And then step two for me is kind of build your AI inventory, as you said. So, list out the tools that everybody's using. And I think finally then classifying the risk, what level of risk are you as a business? So I think that's even if you were to do something this week, starting there, that's what I'm taking away from it. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And just before I get to John's question, I see there in the chat. So I will be providing student tutorials in Module 9, the governance and ethics piece of the AI Certified Diploma. If you scan the QR code here, you can try Module 9 for free for 2 weeks, I believe, which is fantastic. So you can get in there, get some information, get some insights from AI Certified, which are absolutely excellent. So I highly recommend that. So scan that QR code. I believe the deck will be shared. So obviously all these links will function. When you have the deck, you can go directly to their website, see what else they offer and how it can support your business going forward. And if you wish to connect with me, the links are there at the bottom of the page as well. So John, how do the USA and the EU regulations align, or is there any alignment? So there's minimal alignment. Um, the US has essentially put in place a regulation similar to how they operate startup businesses. They're more free and open. They just want general kind of human rights protected, but they're not as strict from a documentation, governance framework, human oversight perspective as the European Union are. And to give an example of where there may be alignment globally versus where there isn't. The in Vietnam, they just enacted their own EU AI Act, for want of a better term, called Law 134 2015 QH, and it's an 85% copy and paste job from the European Union, and I expect everyone else in Southeast Asia to essentially follow suit. So it's quite easy to operate in this region when people are just copying what's happening in Europe. Another example is the UK. So the UK has a data usage and AI policy since 2025, but it's not one single coherent policy. It's like 5 different pieces of legislation that all tie together to be an overarching AI compliance piece. And about 50% of what they have will align directly with the European Union. And whatever you have put in place for the EU will cover that 50%. And then you will have to do specific things within the UK markets to meet the additional standards. So in the US, they have challenged the EU on the EU AI Act and said that it is too harsh. It's too much of a burden to manage from a compliance framework perspective. So they have essentially produced an EU AI Act light. So it will be easy for European companies who are compliant in this jurisdiction to complete that gap analysis and go into the US because it's more intensive in Europe. But as a US company coming into Europe, you'll definitely have a bigger compliance debt burden transferring over. And I would be happy to touch base in more detail on that as the act develops. So in America, because they literally just launched it. So similar to what happened in Europe in 2024 when they passed the EU AI Act, we're now in 2026 and it's finally cemented. It took 2 years to pass the law and actually get it fully cemented as to what's going to happen. So America just passed theirs, and it's a similar situation. It's a lighter touch than the EU AI Act, but it's going to take some time to really understand um, what's going to be involved.
Super. Well, Alan, thank you very much for that today. I hope everybody got some value from that, really demystifying what is a big task for all of us ahead of us. But I think once you become familiar with these steps and the way Alan's laid it out, I think it becomes manageable. So thank you very much, Alan. Appreciate it. And yeah, everybody who's interested in looking at the governance and ethics module, do feel free to scan the QR code. And then Alan has also kindly offered to connect with everybody here. So yeah, he can follow up with you, and he will also be doing our tutorials on this topic. So thank you very much again, Alan. Appreciate it.
Everyone's very welcome, and enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.
Thanks all. Take care now. Bye bye.